There are a couple of questions which I get asked more often than not regarding the stroker build, and I thought, seeing as there's still a ton of snow on the ground,
oh my god,
and therefore the BMW is like a fancy ornament, it was worth making a little video just to address some of them and to give some of you my opinions and my thoughts on, first of all, was the stroker build worth it? And secondly, how much did it cost? I don't like adding numbers up. It's not healthy for the mind. I suppose it's probably worth doing. At the moment, I can't really use the E36 because of the aforementioned snow and the fact that unfortunately it didn't pass that MOT that you saw me mention last time round. There'll be a video showing more about that coming up fairly soon, but a brief overview is I need to buy some tyres, and there's a few other little bits and bobs that needed sorting. In the meantime, let's talk about, was it worth doing a stroker build on my E36 328? Depending on the person you are and what you're looking to achieve by modifying or tinkering or playing around with your car, the answer is going to change and vary. If you're just looking to increase the power on your car and you don't really care about the process that's behind that, then building a stroker engine and putting it together yourself is probably not for you. I would say for me, the build was worth it because not only has it given me a slightly more powerful car, it's given me a lot of experience, it's given me a lot of pleasure, and ultimately I've learnt a lot from doing the actual process. I suppose the short answer to the question is, personally, was it worth it? Yes. I've loved the actual process of going through and learning how to do what I've achieved. I love the final result of it. I don't love the fact that it's never perfect. I don't love the fact that it's not maybe what you might expect it to be. The stroker engine is never going to be comparable to an M3 3-litre engine. The increase in torque and power are not really, they're not groundbreaking, you know, so the whole process of going through doing this is quite a lot of money to put in to actually achieve what is really not a huge change. It's not a step change in you know, engine capacity and engine power, but it does alter the characteristics of the car quite dramatically, and it makes the car feel like a different machine to some degree. Ultimately, the core feeling of driving an E36 is still there, and what I mean by that is it still has it's still got the torque, it's still got the ease of acceleration. I find the E36 is, in some regards, a really relaxing car to drive, and in others, it's actually quite hard work to drive. I'll say something right now which is going to shock quite a lot of you. You know, if you've watched my channel, that I've got a little Honda Civic as well. I love driving the Honda Civic because it's a piece of piss to drive. You get in that thing and it's nothing is heavy. The gear change is simple. I don't really care about it too much, so I'm not worried about it if there's an odd thing which isn't quite perfectly right. Any of you which have been down the road which I've been down and love your car as much as I love my E36 will know that you want everything to be perfect. You know, you want the fixes that you've done and the improvements you've made to feel like they're worth doing, to feel like you've got some value from them. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes it makes it feel like it wants to kick you in the ass every day. At the moment, I'm kind of going through one of those phases where, you know, you fix one thing and another thing breaks and it sucks. You know, you really feel like, what have I done this for? But you have to keep remembering always the end goal and what you've actually got under your belt and all the blood, sweat and the tears that's gone into creating the thing you've created. And you've got to feel proud of that and enjoy it. Whether other people think you're wrong or you're right, you've got to do it for yourself. So that's, I suppose, the crux of that one question. Was it worth it? It's only worth it if you get enjoyment out of it. The other question I get is, how much does it cost? And like I just said, I don't like adding up costs. I'm looking down here because I've got my laptop in front of me, and I'm just going to bring up a little document that I've got here showing some of the costs. As a very brief rundown though, to give you an idea, I think it's cost me somewhere in the region of about £1,700. Let's see. Now, these totals aren't final, obviously. And there's a lot of stuff included in here you don't need to actually build a stroker. I'll give you some costs and then I'm going to run it down for you. So I reckon, roughly speaking, in parts, it cost me about £600. In gaskets and in bolts and in all sorts of other sundries and little bits and bobs here and there and machining and blah, 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 I think I'm probably in for about £1,000. That also includes things like oil pressure gauge, AEM gauge, adapters, all sorts of other stuff. I'll go into some more detail in a moment. And then in tools, so kind of specific tools for doing the task, I reckon it's probably cost me about £150. Let's go into it in some more detail. So to begin with, the core things that you're going to need are going to be the rotating assembly from a E36 330 CI. So that includes the crankshaft, the conrods, the pistons, and the intake camshaft. I got an extremely good deal on the car that I bought to be able to take things apart to get the actual hardware out of myself. I don't want to say the exact price of it, but I paid a lot less really than I should have done for that car because it was on its last legs and the person that sold it to me didn't want the hassle of fixing the car. It needed quite a few things doing to it. So I bought the car and I managed to sell enough parts. So that basically cost me a net nil. In all fairness, if that hadn't happened in me in my life, then I probably wouldn't have bothered going down this path because I've had to buy everything on its own. Now, when I was looking at buying those parts separately, I think it would have cost about £400 or £500, and I believe it's roughly similar to that now. As you may know if you've watched the series, then I used an M50B30 inlet cam as an exhaust. That camshaft alone cost me £75, and then there was some machining that needed to be done to that, which probably cost I think about £40. That was taking the face off the intake cam and doing the end of the sprocket or the end of the pinion on the thanks Howard, or doing the end of the sprocket in the M54 intake cam. So all in there, I reckon we're looking at, come on Howard, come on, out you get, come on mate. Fuck's sake, man. So that's kind of like the hardware that you're going to have to use. But in association with that, you've also got things to think about. Like, okay, I'm going to take an engine apart here. How far do I want to go to make sure it all runs right? This is down to personal choice. I mean, you can take the engine apart. I would always say if you take a head off of any BMW engine or any engine, to be frank, you want to give it at least a little skim to clean that surface up so that you get a good seal in the head gasket afterwards. So that's machining cost that has to come into it. That I would kind of class under the parts system at £1,000. I'm just going to read off some of the things here. So a Victor Rines head gasket kit, or I actually got the gasket and a few other bits separately, but you're looking at, Autodoc I think today are selling the whole kit for about £240 with stem seals and all the rest of the stuff. We obviously need to think about things like an oil filter housing gasket. You're going to want to change that if you're taking the whole engine apart. They leak like crazy. You'll have seen plenty of videos online about those problems. So whilst you're in there, you might as well do that. You're going to want bottom end bearings. You're going to want conrod bearings and main cap bearings. Sump gasket. You're going to think about wiring your oil pump nut or welding it. I would suggest wiring it always. Radiator hoses are changed. O2 sensors are changed. That was not cheap. I bought NGK O2 sensors, so they were like £170 alone just for the two of them. But whilst you're in there, you might as well make it all fresh. What else did we buy there? Main cap bolts. BMW specified that you should always change the main cap bolts because they're essentially stretch bolts. There's varying different paths on whether or not that's kind of the case. They're really expensive from BMW, but I managed to find a bolt supplier which I managed to buy I think 100 of those bolts for about £22, exactly the same grade and make of phosphate covered bolt. Conrod bolts, they're stretch bolts, they definitely have to be changed, there's no question in that. When you see one of those, you'll notice that they've got a scalloped shank and they definitely can't be used twice, so they cost like £25 for a set. Cylinder head dowels, if you don't remove them successfully with a pair of pliers, you're going to bugger them up, so I had to buy a couple of them. It was £10. Front and rear crank seals, obviously you've got to be changing them, and if you do what I did, the first front one you put in, you crapped it out and you put it in too far and it leaked like crazy, so we needed two of them. And then there's a few other little bits which are again quite specific to what I did. So I've got a Tim oil pressure gauge. That gauge itself was about £40, I think. You need an adapter to connect that to the Vanos outtake or intake port on the oil filter housing. So that little adapter was like £12. Because I used an M52 block at first, I didn't think I was going to need to buy a new oil baffle plate, but As you know, I changed to the M50 block. So the block itself cost me, I got a really good deal. I paid £110 for the bare block, but I needed a baffle plate for it. That was 25 quid. The wideband itself was 170. I didn't want to buy a cheap one. There's a lot of things that I will cheap out on, but there are certain items that you can't save money on. You've got to, like buying bolts from BMW versus buying bolts from a metal bolt plate place, a company which sells bolts for a living. I can't see why, you would buy them from BMW when you can buy the same bolt for a fraction of the price from a company that sells bolts for, their main industry. But when you come to buy something like the oil pressure gauge or the bottom end bearings, the crankshaft bearings, all that sort of thing, you've got to spend the money on it, or you're kind of wasting your time because you're going to be changing those things way too quickly later on. The wideband, goes without saying, you want it to be reading the right things. Cheaping out on something like that is a false economy, really. So, we spent a bit of cash there. Piston rings. Goats piston rings, I think I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm probably not. They were £101. So they're not cheap. I went with stock M54B30 piston rings, although there are some internet forums which we'll talk about people having problems with oil burn with those rings. There are as many posts talking about it's because of the way people drive those cars and the way they warm them up and the way they bed those rings in that causes the problem in the first place. I don't have any problems with oil burning whatsoever. Car doesn't burn a drop of oil. It's done nearly 5,000 miles now, so yeah, I've no issue with that whatsoever. It's just that you have to be quite careful how you bed them in. Short shifter, you don't need that, but I was putting that in whilst I was there. Timing cover gasket, I had to buy 2 of them because I bought the wrong one to begin with. They're not a lot of money, but they're there, 5 quid. I bought the stem seals, the upper chain and the lower chain, and a few other bits from a seller online on eBay. They were brand new parts. They'd never been used for the build that they were intended for, so they were still in our packets, and including that was Supertech valve stem seals. They're another part you don't want to cheap out on. They're a pain in the ass to change, so spend the money where you need to spend the money. I think I paid about 80 quid for the whole lot of that, so I was really lucky. Fuel injectors, you don't need to change fuel injectors. A lot of you who might have watched my videos are wondering why I've used Volvo injectors. I have mentioned before, but on a very basic level, they're a lot cheaper to buy than M52 pink top injectors. I wanted to get a set that I could refurbish before they went in the car, so I opted to go for the Volvo ones and adjusted my fueling maps to be able to run them just like pink tops. So they were like 35 quid for the injectors and the rebuild kit was about 21. But that's an expense that you don't have to spend. You can use the M52 pink tops. They're perfectly capable of running an M50B30 engine, no issues whatsoever. You can add on to that a bunch of other little bits and bobs. Obviously oil, coolant, brake fluid, whatever else you're going to be swapping whilst you're in there. And it adds up. That's why, we're looking at a total of like £1,700 to do this. This doesn't include anything for tuning because I've done all the tuning myself. All I've had to pay for the tuning is a bit of software from the ROM Raider forum which allows me to read and write to the ECU. That's MS41 Quick Flash. Buy it, just don't even question it. Go and find somewhere where you can get a hold of it. Go on the ROM Raider forum and find a link to it. Buy that piece of software. If you've got an M52 or an M50, that's a valuable bit of kit that you're worth paying the money for. Another thing I've bought is Mega Log Viewer. That allows me, if you've watched my tuning video, to be able to view the logs. Buy that, don't waste your money. But everything else on that side of things was basically free to me, which is going to cost you, if you don't know how to do that, quite a bit of cash. So you can probably add on, if you don't know anything about tuning and you're going to take your car to somebody to do it, you can probably add another 5, 6, 7, even more £100 onto the actual cost of building this car if you don't know how to be tuning it yourself. And then we got tools. You don't need every tool in a box, and if I'm honest, you don't need a lot of stuff to do a stroker build, but you do need a pretty handsome set of tools, which you already kind of had. So what you got to remember are there's some specific things which are going to help you make this journey a lot easier. For example, you're putting your main bearings in, you're putting your conrod bearings in, you want to check the thickness of them. The best way to do that is with micrometers and my measuring tools. The second best way is to use plastic gauge. It doesn't cost a lot, but it's another cost that you've got to think about. So it costs about 6 quid for a packet of plastic gauge. Stem seal pliers. It sounds like a silly one. 7 quid's worth of pliers from eBay, made removing stem seals and putting new ones in, Really easy. It's worth spending a couple of quid on a pair of pliers for it. I bought a Permatex gasket kit, so I bought the copper sprayer gasket and Permatex assembly lube in a sort of joint pack, which wasn't cheap, it was 25 quid, but no it wasn't, it was nearly 30 quid. But they're really good products, so you don't have to use the copper sprayer gasket, but I decided that on all the hard gaskets, like the Vanos unit metal gasket goes to the head, and the one that goes from the timing cover to the block, it was quite useful to have something just to give you that little bit of reassurance that you're not going to get any leaks, so that's why I used that. A valve spring compressor. I've never used a valve spring compressor before I did this job. I managed to do it on my old Honda engines with a tool that I made and brute force pushing down the valve springs. I'm getting a bit old for that now, and I think the BMW valve springs are slightly tighter than the ones in the Honda, because there was no way I was going to be able to do it that way. So I bought a spring compressor, a cheap one, you know, just a big G-clamp basically with a couple of rods and, you know, the associated little sort of nuts, if you like. Made the job really easy, so that was 16 quid, used that. You saw me using in the previous videos a degree tool and a dial indicator to set up the valve lift on bucket 6 of the engine. That cost me about 20 quid to buy those parts, but I went on later on to buy something from a chap in America, which made that process even easier, and I'll come back to that. A cylinder honer, just to clean the bores up, you know, we're not talking about reboring or overboring the cylinder bores here, but something to clean them up in a regular way, which is not going to leave high points and low points, just to take off any old glaze. That cost me 15 quid. That was just one of those things you chuck in a drill and you run it in and out the bores. Made a really nice job of doing it, and it, you know, made sure that when I took the glaze off, you could see if there was any, you know, lip at the top of the bores or anything like that. And then, you know, a timing locking pin. I never had a timing locking pin before I did this engine job. If you've been in the BMW oil for a while, you'll know what I mean. It's like a long rod with a little sort of spigot sticking out of one end of it, and it goes through the hole in the block, locks the flywheel in place, and allows you to play with the engine whilst you muck around with it, and it doesn't knock the timing of the crank out. That was £12.50, and it was the best £12.50 I've probably spent on a BMW so far. It does a really good job of holding things in place while you're doing up, you know, crank bolts, and whilst you're messing around with the timing, which I've ended up doing more than once in the car. So definitely worth the investment. Going back to the timing blocks, there's a chap in the US called Perry Hubblings, I think. If you search on Google for M50 intake cam timing blocks, he is printing timing blocks in the US and selling them for all sorts of different degrees of Vanos timing for the intake and the exhaust timing on an M50 and M52 block. And they are basically 3D printed blocks which allow you to just snap them onto the ends of the camshaft and set the timer up without any titting around. And you know, those things, man, they just make your life so much easier. The thing with the dial indicator and, you know, the associated arm to hold it is there's nowhere really to set that on a BMW engine cylinder head. It's a pain in the ass. So, you know, I ended up with it sort of stuck on an axle stand above the engine, you know, hanging down. You never quite know if you're bang on or not. So you have to check 3 or 4 times to make sure you get everything right. Those blocks just, it's a piece of cake, man. You know, you snap them on, adjust the cam, tighten everything up, and you're done. So brilliant. So there you go. That's kind of like a basic rundown of all the parts. I'm sure there's many things that I've forgotten. There's little O-rings, there's paper gaskets, there's all sorts of other little bits and bobs, but fundamentally these are the main things that you're going to need that are going to, you know, allow you to build the same sort of stroker that I've built. And we go back to that question, is this all worth it? An extra 20 or 30 brake horsepower, hours and hours of work, loads of parts, loads of expense. My E36 now, I bought the E36 for just over £500. If you add on wheels and all the rest of it, it's probably cost me something in the order of about £3,500. And then fuel is horrendous. But yeah, it is worth it. For me anyway, I wouldn't take it back. And I do love it. There you go. Hopefully this gives you a bit of insight. Thank you very much for watching and continuing to watch my videos. I really appreciate your support and your engagement and all your comments, guys. So keep it coming. Keep doing what you do best. It's Pamo out.